So I have the opportunity to say a few things about fire from the standpoint of a landowner, because my wife and I own 15 acres about 5 miles from here, and we were exposed to a fire that was a portion of the Carlton complex. And it was not the Carlton itself, but it was one that came about because of a flat tire on a trailer. And through that experience, I've learned a lot about what you do after a fire and all these sorts of things. And through my work, I had no intention of this traumatic experience being a boost to my career. And I've gone around and I've told a story called Our House Almost Burned Down. Some of you have seen it. But this one is more about the forest itself and what could happen and some of the things that you might deal with as a landowner if you experience fire. We've been hearing some wonderful presentations today about dry forest and habitat and the ecology of all of this circumstance. You are here in the dry forest zone, and that question of fire always bad, suppression, control, and I don't really need to go into the introduction too much because we now really pretty fully understand dry forest ecology. Derek's excellent presentation about ways to respond, things about how it affects the forest, survival, stocking density, fuel loading, all of these terminologies that not many years ago were pretty foreign to most of us. And part of the reason to be here is to get it all up on the radar screen to talk about this. And somebody even said this already today. It's not if you're going to get a fire, it's when, and how are you going to deal with that if it happens. Well, sometimes you can have the best intentions and it all burns up. Something happens to you. And what if it's your property? What if your precious little piece of the world got hammered? And that's what happened to us. That's my little forest. And I had the biggest plans. I was going to go out and prune and thin and plant. Now notice that bitter brush. I lived in a world of ignorance and naivety. And I did not have my level of awareness and knowledge about dry forest to where it is now before this happens. Isn't that pretty cool? These nice open-grown pine trees, this bitter brush about 6 feet high, nice habitat. Uh-oh, big-time flammable. Guess what happened? Boom, that flat tire sent a fire roaring across our hill, and it killed everything. It killed all of the trees. It didn't even crown a lot of them. Dale mentioned preheating, cooking the cambium. That's exactly what happened here. I mean, you look at that and it's like, oh my gosh. And all of a sudden, we got to deal with this thing. I had a chance in my work, which is really interesting. I went out to at least 5 or 6 landowners to look at their property after it burned. And the questions that came up were repetitive because I work, and I'm going to get to this, but I work in the DNR's Forest Stewardship Program, as many of you know, and I'm a wildlife biologist, but I'm also a forester, and I had a chance to go out to places where people had their little piece of heaven and it got hammered. It's really hard. It is a very emotional thing. How attached are you to your forest? And when it's destroyed, it's a hard thing. And so that's just something to be aware of. That's Terry and I, my wife, the day after. And so now what? Well, that's kind of something to consider when you look at all these things that are affected. Like, the power pole burned down. My neighbor's shop burned down. I like the nails in a row right there. This is my neighbor. In fact, tomorrow on the field trip, you're going to park the school bus right where that truck sat, and the bloody thing melted. Chipmunks burned up. I found dead snakes. It was really hard. Well, when the fire goes through, if it really, really burns hot, it obviously kills your trees, but the most profound thing that's affected in the short term anyway is the soil. The soil is really the totally vulnerable thing to sit there. And so I'm going to speak a little bit to this about these effects and how we can respond. So if you experience something like this, stepping into the resource manager person away from trauma, the first thing you've got to do is figure out what's going on. Now, having a fire come through is sort of like resetting your land management plan. You've had something very, very profound happen that's almost like super duper site prep. Really, you start thinking about it. I mean, it's like, so you got to look at what you have. Oops, wrong direction here. Where am I going here? What did I do? There we go. Wrong button. There we go. So you want to look at how many trees survived. You got to look at the slopes. You've got to look at the types of soils, how many live trees, how many dead trees, how much fuel is there after the fire. What about the shrub revegetation? How is this thing going to respond? You've got to go all the way back through and look at all this stuff. If you're lucky, you may have a situation like that. This burned down near Cleellum about in the Taylor Bridge fire, and this stand had been treated. Check out the survival there. Right over the hill from that, they had complete burnout in the same fire. Lance, you might remember that spot. Something that you cannot anticipate very well is after the fire, sometimes these bloody beetles come bopping along on these little, can I say a cuss word, Elaine?
You're being recorded, whatever you
These
want.
little buggers. And they come in and they eat the cambium on those freshly killed trees. And sometimes there'll be trees that survive the fire that die. Bam, right afterwards, like that one right there. That came from this flush of beetles that come out from the burn. They come in, they're in the cambium of the freshly killed trees, and it's almost like a secondary fire that goes out. It's really interesting because there'll be a band of it, and then it'll subside. And this happened on our hill, and this happened with that. But you can't necessarily predict that. So now, as a wildlife biologist, and many of you know this, and I hope you can be here tonight because I have prepared a presentation that's never before been given that highlights and features lots of you people here. No, I'm not going to sing now, but I am tonight. And I'm an evangelical snaggist. Many of you know that I just love dead trees. And after a fire, you would think I'd be really, really happy about all these dead trees. Well, it's pretty cool. You do get a lot of dead wood. Sometimes you might have too much. But anyway, so that's one of the influences. You have this gigantic influx of dead wood. There's a busted off tree on our place here, woodpeckers, cavities, all this stuff. So there's one group of creatures that are really happy about fires, and that's woodpeckers and the other birds. So there's a habitat influence about dead wood coming in. But you're going to have to look at 6 key things to deal with if you experience a significant fire. The first one is, what's your long-term goal? I thought that was really interesting what they were just saying a few minutes ago about stocking density in this dry forest ecology, 25 to 40 trees per acre. Wait a second, that's not a crop. I want 150 trees per acre. Well, you're going to have to monkey with this stuff. So what's your long-term goal for your property? Go back. Elaine, I'm having technical problems here. My wife would say, you're just throwing your buttons around. So these are the things you've got to look through. Are you going to salvage log? What about erosion? What about replanting? What about weeds? What about anything proactive you can do anticipating the next thing? Because a lot of times the first thing that pops into people's minds is, can I salvage log it? Can I go get those trees? Look, they're dead. We got to get in there and get them. And that comes up, and there's some elements to that. And many, many times people do salvage log, which can be, a very effective thing to do. However, your timeline is really short. How many months you get? About 8? Doug fir, maybe a year. Correct me if I got this wrong. Ponderosa pine, you get about 6 months. Now think about that. All of a sudden, there's all these people with dead trees, and you're going to try to find a logger to go get them to get to a mill that you hope is not full. What happened in these big fires was the mills were full, the contractors were completely occupied, and people actually couldn't sell their trees. Doug fir, yeah, you could. So it was almost off the table. It was hard to find a place to take this wood. You couldn't sell it. That's what happened. So it was pretty interesting, and sometimes they did. Well, sometimes I saw a couple of salvage sales that were really bad ideas. Look at the soil damage on this spot right here. They went out and cut every tree in this dry area, and I'm going to go back and see that one because that was like, yow. With the soil in a really delicate condition, that was a tough spot. Winter logging, way better. If you can do it in the winter, if you can get a contractor, you get the conditions just right. So it's tough on the soil if it's timed wrong. That's an important point. So this is, does anybody know Fern Rosenblatt? Fern Rosenblatt suffered a horrible tragedy. She and her husband Roger had this beautiful tree farm, nicely managed near here. Roger passed away, and then a month later, boom, the Okanagan fire comes ripping through there. And look at that stand. That's actually pretty good stocking. It killed everything. So we did a consultation talking about salvage and everything. So they went through, they winter logged it, they got a good contractor, they left about 4 trees per acre. There's no soil damage. They did a really good job, but that is her tree farm. This is another site, this is actually near here, that was on a conservation easement. And look, this one has some survival. So one of the things was they left all of the live trees, they left a certain number of snags per acre, we said 4, and they created some, they nipped some off. So that was done in the winter too, and that had very little soil damage. Then there's erosion. What do you do about erosion control? What if you have a really steep slope with a really delicate soil? There's different things you can do, and this is much like construction, where you can use these weird coir things, which my neighbor put out, and I didn't want to tell him that it really wasn't steep enough to need to do that, but he wanted to do something. You've all heard the thing where you can laterally fall trees across the slope, use smaller diameter stuff, but you got to stake them in and make sure that the water doesn't go under them, because it's pointless. Who's ever done that? That's a nice fire crew rehab task. Sometimes there's been extreme things like that in the lower right, where they use machinery and do blocks and draws and all this, all to try to prevent some of that loose soil from going downstream into the waterways. As Cody just pointed out, the influence of this stuff on the water is pretty darn extensive. You can do straw bales in the draws, mulching. Sometimes people would spray mulch around. Water bars. I had a job on a fire when I worked for the Yakima Nation, where we put water bars on all these steep fire trails. So it's a lot like a logging show where you would be trying to control erosion. So you want to replant. Where are you going to get the trees? Who's ever ordered trees from a nursery? Usually you need, a 2-year lag, rough? Well, the fire just happened. And so you're going to show up at the nursery and say, hey, I need 60,000 ponderosa pine trees from seed zone 217 next week. What's Trobaugh going to say to you if you call up Webster? He'd say, well, I'm really sorry. But however, the good news is your site prep sometimes lasts longer than that. So you might be able to get away with it a year later. And sometimes in these burn sites, those little Doug firs in particular, the deer will eat the heck out of them. I saw this down by Cleellum, where they wouldn't eat them if there was a lot of other browse available. So, the behavior of deer, indeed, deer in particular, is selective. So sometimes you might have to put out the bloody Vexar tubes. So, yeah, I said that. It's hard to get the trees on short notice. Then there's extreme rehab for us small landowners, is where you might actually irrigate and put cages out. You'll see this tomorrow. We actually hired a contractor, and I have this beautiful set of shrubs and trees coming in. You water a ponderosa pine in this country, 4 years later, I got one that's like 8 feet high. Check it out. This is West Side leaders. That's what happens if you water something. Yes. There we go. So here's one too. A lot of times people say, well, should I plant grass seed? They fly around with helicopter stories. Well, you want to grow grass, you want to grow trees. If you put out a whole competing mat of grass, that might actually inhibit your trees coming back. If you're growing cattle, that might be a great thing to do. So this is Fern's place again, and I can't remember if she seeded. Does anybody know? I don't think she did. So I'm pretty sure that was not seeded, and stuff comes back like crazy. So there you go. Weeds, you got to know what you got. Now, here's one thing with the weed issues is most of the weeds that come in after these fires in dry country really are not an issue for forestry. Thistle, knapweed, they're issues for browse and raising cattle and things. But weeds are important because, boom, they're going to come in like that. You know what you got, go get them, do the right thing, get some help. Talk to your conservation district, whoever you got locally to know what you have and what you need to do. Now, here's one, too. This is, post-fire proactive forestry, and that would be, do you need to do fuel reduction after it burned? Now, that's an interesting question. I would suggest probably, because a lot of times the fire comes through, it kills the trees, but there's still a lot of sticks and stuff out there. So this is a case where they piled it, and then they left 2 per acre for wildlife, and they burned the rest of the piles. So, that's actually not a bad approach. This is Dan Lennon from down in Klickitat. That's his property, and he was like, I am not leaving fuel out here around my house. So do you reduce the fuel loading in burn stands? I would suggest you probably should. And it's up to you, though. It's really kind of the same issues as before the fire about fuel loading. There's an example from Sherman Pass, though, because the standing dead trees, while they're standing, generally do not influence spread that much, simply because the fuel's up there and not, on the ground. But it can increase future risk. Now, this is sort of repeating everything that's been said, but it's best to do something beforehand so that it doesn't get into that high-intensity fire. So, your basic chipping, that's a treated stand near Chelan, which I just love that because there's a down log, there's a couple snags, there's a little dense patch. These big machines, these contractors, there's a lot of good work going on doing this. And Dale pointed out this is no substitute for fire in regard to the chemical nature of the soil, but it's what we can do. Hey, Lance, where's that? This is on Suncadia. This is a stand that has been actively managed for multiple years to keep fuel loadings down, a nice shrub layer. If you want to see some really good dry forest management, go into the Suncadia Resort right outside of Roslyn. There's some remarkable stuff that Phil Hess and Lance and others have done, and that's an example there. So that's a good example. And here's something that's kind of on an optimistic note. The land recovers far better than we imagine. I mean, this is a fire-adapted ecosystem. That's an aspen stand that was 4 months after the Carlton, and those things it started sprouting like a week after the fire. Coming back, there we go. This is 2 years later in an aspen stand that had complete crown mortality, and those stems are like 7 feet high. Same stand there. Then the little pine trees start to show up sometimes. Now, if you get natural regeneration of conifer, it's really dependent on the cone crop of the particular year of the fire and whether or not there's nearby seed sources with these patches, like describing this patchy landscape. That's what's going to seed in. Sometimes there'll be places where it burns so hot that it takes a long time, but they start showing up, it's like, wow, and there's lots of expertise on that, but those surviving leaf trees are important. So just a couple of shots there. Spring of 2016, and that's that same place that was all burned up at the very, very start of the presentation. Standing dead trees, see that right now would not burn. You're going to go there tomorrow. You're going to see that stand that was not thinned, that was completely unmanaged, that crowned out. But that's where we're going to go tomorrow, and just to see how much it's changed, which not much. They start breaking off, they start tipping over, but the flowers and the shrubs come back like crazy. Down in the Blue Mountains, there was a big fire a few years back on WDFW and Forest Service land. They did an extensive helicopter salvage, leaving behind anything that was alive. This is when Doug Keene worked on Dale. And that actually looks pretty good. Dry forest stuff right there. The shrub layers come back like crazy. Good habitat. So the land does recover, and it recovers better than we think. And so that's just something to remind ourselves. In our management, we can move the conifer elements forward. So I'm almost done. So the Woodland Fish and Wildlife Series, maybe many of you have seen these publications that I'm really happy that I get to work on. And this one is about wildlife-friendly fuels. And we're writing one right now called Your Forest Burned Up, Now What? So that's coming out next year. It was supposed to be done today. I apologize for the tardiness there. So I'd like to do a shout out for our DNR staff here. All of our DNR, Rob, wave your arm. There's Rob Leinberger back there, our stewardship forester for Eastern Washington. There you go. Right next to him, that handsome fellow is Matt. There you go, Matt Provencher from Western Washington. Well done. Julie Sackett over here. Sackett, stand up for a second. So Hillary mentioned the strategic plan. She jumped ship from us and moved up to run that strategic plan. So when you have questions about Eastern Washington right there. Where's Guy Gifford? Is Guy still here? Here's Guy Gifford, our Spokane Firewise wizard. I'm hearing claps here. Boyd Norton up there in Northwest, give us a wave there. Yay. So these DNR programs, I mean, I have to say, I've worked in different agencies and everything. I like DNR because we get stuff done. And we've got very competent people who are here to help you. And I'm delighted to be here. I see so many friends and people have gotten to your property and everything. And so we try to do a good thing. This particular environment, we're living in these dry forests. You know, we're beginning to understand what it's going to take to build this resilience so that as the future comes, which you can't ever stop, we'll be better prepared for it to survive. So there you go. Thank you. All right.